My name is Ryan, and I worked as a bartender at Raven's Bar in New Orleans, Louisiana. It was a Saturday night, and the bar was overflowing with people as it usually was on weekends. The music was loud enough to keep conversations private, but soft enough that laughter and arguments still floated through the air in pieces. Men in expensive jackets crowded around the counter discussing sports and business deals, while groups of women occupied the booths near the windows with cocktails resting in front of them. Glasses clinked constantly. Waitresses moved from table to table carrying trays above their shoulders, and every stool around the counter had been occupied since 8 in the evening. I'd been working behind the counter for nearly 2 years by then, and one thing that experience teaches a bartender is how to read people before they even speak. Some customers walked in celebrating promotions. Some entered after fights with their partners. Some came looking for company, while others came specifically to avoid it. Around 9:30 that night, the front door opened and a woman stepped inside alone. She could not have been older than 26 or 27. She wore a dark coat despite the warm weather outside, and her eyes immediately caught my attention because they carried the exhausted look of someone who had not slept properly in days. She chose a seat near the far end of the bar away from everyone else, and simply sat there staring at the counter in front of her. She was attractive enough that several men in the room glanced in her direction, but there was something about her expression that discouraged anyone from approaching. She looked less like someone enjoying a night out, and more like someone hiding from the rest of the world for a few hours. I assumed she had gone through a breakup or perhaps received bad news earlier in the day. I called over one of our attendants named Sarah and asked her to politely find out what the woman wanted to drink. Sarah returned moments later and told me the woman wanted whiskey with ice. I prepared the drink myself and watched as Sarah delivered it to her table. The woman finished the first glass quickly and requested another. The second became a third, and the third became a fourth. By 10:30, her face had become flushed and her movements slower. Several times she stared toward the window beside her seat with tears gathering in her eyes before she wiped them away and ordered another drink. By 11 o'clock, she stood from her seat and reached into her purse for cash. Her balance was unsteady, and I honestly wondered if she would make it home safely in her condition. I considered offering to call her a taxi, but before I could leave the counter, she had already thanked Sarah, gathered herself, and walked out through the front entrance. 30 seconds later, I noticed another customer stand from one of the darker booths near the back of the room. He had been sitting alone most of the night, nursing a single beer that he barely touched. At first, I thought nothing of it because customers left all the time, but something about the timing unsettled me. The man had barely looked away from the woman all evening. Every time I glanced toward his table, his eyes seemed fixed in her direction. The feeling in my stomach became impossible to ignore. I stepped away from the counter, told one of the other bartenders to cover for me for a few minutes, and headed outside. The street outside the bar was quieter than usual. The city traffic had thinned, and only the occasional car passed beneath the streetlights. About 50 feet away, I saw the woman standing near an alley entrance, while the man faced her. At first, it appeared he was simply trying to speak with her, but her body language immediately told a different story. She attempted to walk away several times, while he stepped in front of her path. Then I saw him grab her wrist and pull her back toward him. She reacted instantly by slapping him across the face. The sound echoed off the surrounding buildings. For a moment, both of them froze. Then the man's expression changed completely. He struck her hard enough that she fell against the wall beside the alley entrance before collapsing onto the pavement. My first instinct was to run toward them, but I was not a fighter, and the man was much larger than me. Instead, I immediately called the police and gave them our exact location. Only after hearing the operator confirm officers were already nearby did I approach. I shouted at the man to leave her alone and held my phone high enough for him to see the emergency call was still active. The moment he realized the police had been contacted, he released her wrist and ran into the darkness between the buildings. The woman remained motionless on the ground. I knelt beside her and checked for breathing. She was alive. Whether she had lost consciousness from the alcohol or from being struck, I could not tell. The police arrived within minutes along with paramedics. They thanked me for intervening and transported her to the hospital for treatment. One of the officers took my statement and assured me they would contact me if they needed anything further. I returned to work that night feeling shaken but relieved that things had not ended worse than they could have. 3 days later, she walked back into the bar. She looked healthier and far more awake than she had that Saturday night. She explained that she had managed to get my name from one of the officers handling the report and wanted to thank me personally for helping her. She told me her name was Emily Carter, and that she had recently ended a 5-year relationship after discovering her boyfriend had been cheating on her for months. Over the following weeks, she became a regular visitor to the bar. Sometimes she ordered coffee instead of alcohol, and simply sat at the counter talking with me after my shift ended. We learned about each other's lives little by little. Months passed, and our friendship became one of the most important parts of my life. Almost exactly 1 year after the night we met, we started dating. My name is Anthony. I work as a bartender in Lantern Bar. It was Wednesday night in Marrow City. The bar was buzzing with people that night, both men and women filling nearly every table as usual. The sound of glasses touching, music playing from the speakers above the counter, and dozens of overlapping conversations blended into the familiar noise I had grown used to after years of working night shifts. It was 11 p.m., and I was behind the counter preparing another round of drinks while occasionally glancing toward the entrance whenever the door opened and closed. Night shifts had become a normal part of my life. There was something strange about watching a city transform after dark. During the day, people rushed through streets with purpose and responsibilities, but at night, people seemed different. Some came to celebrate birthdays. Some came after work to escape stress. Some came to forget arguments waiting for them at home, and others simply came because they did not want to be alone. As a bartender, you learn how to read people without speaking much to them. You learn who is celebrating, who is lonely, who is angry, and who is pretending everything is fine. Around that time, 2 young women walked into the bar together. They looked like close friends who had probably known each other for years because they moved with the kind of comfort people only have around someone they trust completely. One of them wore a black jacket over a white top, while the other wore a blue dress with a small handbag hanging from her shoulder. They found seats near the middle section of the bar and asked for cocktails. I prepared their drinks and placed them on the counter while they thanked me before returning to their conversation. For the next couple of hours, they were like countless groups of friends I had seen over the years. They laughed often, leaned close to each other while talking over the music, and occasionally held their phones up to take pictures together. Sometimes they looked through the pictures and laughed before taking another one because they did not like the previous angle. At one point, one of them came to the counter to order another round and mentioned that it had been months since they had both been free on the same night. The other joked about how difficult adulthood had become, and how impossible it was to find time for simple things like meeting friends. The atmosphere inside the bar remained lively as midnight approached. More people arrived, while others slowly began leaving. I noticed the 2 women becoming slightly unsteady when they stood up from their seats. They were not causing trouble or creating scenes like some customers did after drinking too much, but it was obvious that the alcohol had affected them. They collected their belongings, checked their phones several times, and eventually walked toward the exit while supporting each other slightly as they laughed about something that had happened earlier in the evening. I remember watching them leave through the glass door and thinking nothing of it. It was an ordinary moment on an ordinary night. Hundreds of customers entered and left Lantern Bar every week, and most of them disappeared back into their lives without me ever seeing them again. I wiped down the counter, served more drinks, and continued working until my shift ended. The following afternoon, I arrived at work expecting another normal day, only to find 2 police officers waiting inside the bar speaking with my manager. The atmosphere felt completely different from usual. The music was off, and several members of staff stood nearby looking nervous. One of the officers approached me and asked whether I remembered serving 2 young women shortly before midnight the previous evening. I immediately remembered them because they had stayed for several hours, and because they had been sitting in a location directly visible from behind the counter. The officers explained that the women had become victims of a violent attack sometime after leaving the bar. They asked me what condition they were in when they left, whether they appeared heavily intoxicated, and whether I had noticed anyone watching them or following them during the night. I answered every question as carefully as I could, but nothing stood out in my memory except the fact that they had seemed happy and completely unaware that anything was wrong. Several days later, one of the investigators returned to speak with me again. By then, local news stations had already begun reporting on the incident, and people throughout Marrow City were talking about it. The investigator explained that security cameras from nearby buildings had allowed them to piece together a timeline of events after the women left the bar. According to the footage, the 2 friends had been walking toward the main road shortly after 1 a.m. while discussing whether to call a taxi or continue walking to a nearby transport stop. The streets in that area were quieter than usual on weekdays, and there were long stretches without pedestrians. At some point, a vehicle stopped nearby and 3 masked men approached them. What followed was every nightmare that people warn others about but secretly believe only happens to strangers in distant places. The investigator described how the women were overpowered and attacked, despite trying to resist. Weapons were used to threaten them and prevent them from escaping. They were grabbed mercilessly by the 3 men. The assault was brutal and left both of them with devastating injuries before the attackers fled the area. One of the women suffered injuries so severe that she fell into a coma shortly afterward. Her friend survived as well, but sustained catastrophic brain injuries that left her permanently paralyzed and unable to move or speak. I remember sitting in silence as the investigator spoke because my mind kept returning to the image of them laughing over photographs only a few hours earlier. I could still remember where they had been sitting. I could remember the drinks they ordered and the expressions on their faces while looking through pictures on their phones. The human brain struggles to accept how quickly an ordinary evening can transform into tragedy. The story spread quickly across Meadow City. News reports showed photographs of police vehicles and crime scene tape, while reporters spoke about the ongoing investigation. Residents began warning friends and family members not to travel alone at night. Social media filled with messages demanding arrests and justice for the victims. Every few days, another report appeared stating that investigators were still searching for the men responsible. For weeks afterward, I found myself staring at customers as they left the bar late at night. Whenever groups of friends stood up to leave after drinking, I caught myself wondering whether they would arrive home safely. I started encouraging customers to use taxis and rideshare services whenever possible, even though it was technically not part of my job. Sometimes people laughed and assured me they lived nearby, but I insisted anyway because once you hear enough stories like that one, caution stops feeling excessive. The strangest part of the entire experience was realizing how ordinary that night had seemed while it was happening. There had been music, laughter, birthday celebrations, football discussions, and people arguing over which songs should play next. Nothing about the atmosphere suggested that 2 lives were only hours away from being permanently changed forever. Even now, years later, I still remember that Wednesday night in Lantern Bar. I remember the crowded room, the flashing lights above the counter, and the sound of people enjoying themselves without a care in the world. Most of all, I remember 2 friends sitting together, taking pictures, laughing about old memories, and believing they would simply go home and continue living their lives the following morning. Sometimes the scariest stories are not about ghosts, monsters, or creatures hiding in darkness. Sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that happen in the real world while everyone else continues dancing, drinking, and believing that horror only exists somewhere far away. My name is Daniel, and I worked as a bartender at Harbor Lights Bar in downtown Chicago. It was a Friday night in early October, and the city felt alive in the way only big cities do when the weekend finally arrived. The streets outside were glowing with reflections from traffic lights and neon signs. Taxis rolled past with impatient drivers leaning on their horns, and every restaurant and club within 3 blocks of us had a line forming outside the entrance. Harbor Lights was no different. By 8 in the evening, every stool at the counter was occupied. Every booth along the walls was filled, and the noise inside the building had blended into that familiar rhythm that bartenders learn to understand without actually listening to it. Glasses clinked together, music played loud enough to energize people but not loud enough to kill conversation, and groups of strangers laughed as though they had known each other for years. I had worked there for almost 6 years, and somewhere during that time I developed the strange ability to notice things that most people ignored. Bartenders become accidental observers of human behavior because we spend entire nights watching hundreds of people interact while pretending not to look at anyone. I could usually tell which couples were on first dates, which groups were celebrating birthdays, which customers were already too drunk for another drink, and which men walking through the door were going to become trouble before they even reached the counter. Around 9 that night, 6 women walked into the bar together, immediately drawing attention from almost every man near the entrance. They looked like they had spent hours preparing for the night. Their dresses were elegant without looking excessive. Their makeup was professionally done, and every one of them carried the kind of confidence that comes from already knowing they looked good before anyone else told them so. They laughed as they entered, looking around for a place to sit, before settling at a large round table near the center of the room, where they could see both the dance floor and the entrance. For the next several minutes, They did exactly what most groups of friends do during girls' nights out. They took pictures together, compared outfits, teased each other over old stories, and laughed loudly enough for nearby tables to occasionally glance over and smile. Eventually, one of them walked over to the bar to place their order. She introduced herself as Maya, while reading drink requests directly from her phone because apparently nobody in the group could agree on what they wanted until the last second. I prepared cocktails for all 6 of them, while she stood there explaining which drink belonged to which friend, because according to her own words, if I mixed them up there would apparently be a civil war at their table before 10 o'clock. As I carried the drinks over, I got my first proper look at the group. 4 of them seemed alert and aware of their surroundings in the way experienced city girls often are. Their eyes moved constantly around the room. They noticed who was looking at them, and they instinctively positioned their bags and phones where nobody could reach them. The other 2 were completely different. One was named Chloe, and the other was named Vanessa. They were friendly, loud, trusting, and far too comfortable accepting attention from strangers. Within 10 minutes, they had already waved at 2 different groups of men they had never met before. By 10 o'clock, the inevitable happened. 3 men approached their table carrying drinks of their own and wearing the kind of confidence that suggested this was not their first attempt of the night. Normally, this sort of thing happened dozens of times every weekend and rarely meant anything serious. Sometimes people genuinely met that way. Sometimes numbers were exchanged, and everybody left happy. Most bartenders stopped paying attention after the first few minutes. For some reason, I kept watching. The tallest of the 3 men did most of the talking, while another kept making jokes that caused the entire table to laugh. The 3rd man barely spoke at all. Instead, he spent most of his time observing everyone around him with the patience of someone waiting for a specific moment to arrive. Something about him bothered me immediately, although I could not explain why. About 5 minutes later, the distraction began. The loud one accidentally knocked over his own drink onto the table, creating instant chaos as napkins were grabbed, phones were moved out of danger, and everyone stood up at once to save purses and dresses from being soaked. It looked clumsy enough to be believable. In fact, if I had blinked at the wrong moment, I probably would have believed it myself. While everyone focused on the spill, the quiet man moved. His hand disappeared into his jacket pocket and emerged almost immediately. His body blocked the view of most of the table, but bartenders notice hands the same way security guards notice faces. I saw his fingers open above 2 unattended glasses for less than a second before he pulled back and resumed helping clean the spill as though nothing had happened. My stomach dropped immediately. I had heard stories from other bartenders. I had watched training videos. I'd even seen security footage from another bar years earlier showing something almost identical. The problem was that from where I stood, I had no proof, only instinct and experience. The girls returned to their seats, and the conversation continued as if nothing had happened. Chloe reached for her drink first. I shook my head slightly toward Maya. At first, she looked confused. I repeated the gesture while glancing directly at the drinks and then toward the man standing closest to them. Her expression changed instantly. Unlike Chloe and Vanessa, Maya understood exactly what I was trying to tell her. Without saying a word, she leaned toward another friend beside her, who immediately understood as well. Within seconds, all 4 of the more street-smart girls were communicating through expressions and subtle gestures that nobody else at the table seemed to notice. Chloe lifted her glass again. Before she could drink, Maya suddenly grabbed her arm and pointed toward the dance floor, while pretending to be excited about a song that had just started playing. Another friend quickly picked up the drink and casually placed it farther away while pretending to make room on the table. Vanessa reached for her own drink moments later. One of the girls immediately switched glasses with her while laughing about somebody drinking from the wrong cup earlier in the night. Vanessa rolled her eyes and accepted the replacement without realizing anything unusual had happened. The men noticed. For the first time, the quiet man's expression changed. He glanced toward the drinks, then toward me behind the counter. I stared directly back at him. He knew that I knew. Within 30 seconds, all 3 men suddenly announced they were leaving for another bar across town despite having arrived less than 15 minutes earlier. Their exit was so fast and so awkward that even Chloe noticed something felt strange. The moment they disappeared through the door, Maya and her friends carried the 2 original drinks directly to the bar and asked me if I had seen what they thought I had seen. I told them everything. The color disappeared from Chloe's face almost immediately. Vanessa looked like she was about to cry. Both admitted they had spent most of the evening paying attention to the men, and almost none of it paying attention to their drinks. One of the girls quietly admitted that something similar had happened to a cousin of hers during university, and that she had spent years blaming herself for it. I remember shaking my head and telling her that blame was not the important part of the conversation. Awareness was. The group stayed another hour after that, but the atmosphere had completely changed. They still laughed, they still danced, and they still took pictures together, but every single one of them watched each other's drinks for the rest of the night. Before leaving, Maya came back to the bar one final time and thanked me for paying attention when nobody else was paying attention. I told her the truth. Most people think bartenders only serve drinks. The good ones spend half their shifts making sure people get home safely enough to drink another night.